It's 1927, in a ward in a London hospital. A nurse walks between the beds doing her rounds. She checks pulses. She adjusts blankets. She speaks softly to the patients. None of them respond. Not because they're unconscious. Their eyes are open. Some of them are watching her. One woman's lips are slightly parted, as if she was mid-sentence when something stopped her. They are, by every technical measure, awake. They have been this way for years. Some of them will stay this way for decades. The doctors call it Encephalitis Lethargica. The newspapers call it the sleepy sickness. The patients, the ones who can still speak, described it as being trapped, fully present, fully aware, and completely unable to reach the world outside their own heads. Nobody knows what's causing it, and nobody ever fully figures it out. And then, as suddenly as it arrived, it just disappeared. The first cases appeared in Vienna in the winter of 1916 to 1917. A neurologist named Konstantin von Economo started seeing patients with a strange cluster of symptoms: fever, headache, extreme lethargy, and a peculiar disruption of sleep. Some patients couldn't sleep at all. Others couldn't stop. Some fell asleep mid-conversation, and some entered a state that looked like sleep but wasn't. Eyes open, body still, and mind somewhere unreachable. He published his findings in 1917. Nobody paid much attention. There was a world war happening. Then, the 1918 influenza pandemic swept across the globe, killing somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. And in its wake, the sleeping sickness followed. Between 1916 and 1927, an estimated 1 million people worldwide were affected. Around a third of them died during the acute phase. Another third recovered, more or less. And the final third, somewhere in the region of 300,000 to 500,000 people, survived the initial illness only to enter a different kind of imprisonment. They became what neurologists called post-encephalitic, frozen, not paralyzed, not comatose, just stop. Some sat in the same position for years. Some were capable of occasional speech, occasional movement, occasional moments of full lucidity, and then the stillness would return, like a tide coming back in, and they'd be gone again. And then by the late 1920s, new cases stopped appearing just like that. The epidemic ended, the frozen patients remained, and medicine moved on, leaving them behind in long-stay institutions where most of them would spend the rest of their lives. So what was it? Here is the central mystery of encephalitis lethargica. Despite affecting hundreds of thousands of people over more than a decade, despite leaving survivors frozen in institutions for the rest of their lives, we never definitively identified what caused it. The obvious suspect was the 1918 influenza virus. The timing lined up, the geography overlapped, and it seemed logical that the flu was attacking the brain in some patients in an unusual way, but the evidence never held. When researchers went back and tested preserved tissue samples from post-encephalitic patients decades later, they found no consistent traces of the 1918 influenza virus. Some samples showed it, many didn't. And crucially, cases of encephalitis lethargica had appeared before the 1918 pandemic, meaning the flu couldn't be the sole cause. Other theories emerged: a streptococcal bacteria triggering an autoimmune response in the brain, a separate unknown virus that happened to coincide with the influenza pandemic, an environmental trigger, and the last theory, a convergence of multiple factors that created a perfect neurological storm, but none of them fully fit. And here's the detail that makes this story haunting. Encephalitis lethargica never completely disappeared. Sporadic cases have been reported ever since. Clusters in the 1990s in the UK, isolated cases into the 2000s and beyond, and in virtually every cluster, the same pattern emerges. The patients don't match the flu virus, the cause is unclear, and the neurological damage is devastating. We don't know what caused it in 1916, and we don't know what causes the sporadic cases now. We don't have a test for it, we don't have a proven treatment, and because it's rare enough to be classified as an orphan disease, it sits in a quiet corner of neurology, largely forgotten. In 1966, a young neurologist named Oliver Sacks began working at Beth Abraham Hospital in New York, a long-stay institution housing dozens of post-encephalitic survivors. Some of them had been there since the 1920s. They were elderly now. They had spent 40 years frozen. Sacks spent years with them, talking to them, or trying to, reading to them, and observing. And then in 1969, he tried something. A new drug called L-DOPA had been developed to treat Parkinson's disease, which, as it turned out, shared some neurological features with the post-encephalitic state. The drug replenished dopamine in the brain, restoring some of the motor function that had been lost. Sacks administered it to his frozen patients, and they woke up. Not all of them, not completely, and not permanently, But patient after patient, people had been essentially motionless for decades, began to move, to speak, to remember, to reach back through 40 years of stillness and reconnect with the world. One woman picked up a conversation she'd started in 1926. One man asked what year it was told it was 1969, and said nothing for a very long time. Sachs documented all of it in his 1973 book, Awakenings, later adapted into a film with Robin Williams and Robert De Niro. But the awakenings for most patients didn't last. The brain, after decades of dormancy, couldn't sustain the adjustment. Side effects emerged: tics, compulsions, new neurological crises. One by one, most patients returned to their frozen state or developed complications that were in some ways worse. The drug had briefly opened a door, then the door closed again. Sachs spent the rest of his career trying to understand what encephalitis lethargica had done to the brain and never arrived at a complete answer. And then he died in 2015, and the question still remains open.